Hello, I'm Emma Belsky. From 2021 to 2022, while I was a student at Mount St. Mary's University, I interviewed several professors about texts that they loved teaching and reading. I'm happy to share these recordings with you now as the Grade 8 podcast. Enjoy!
Welcome back to the Grade 8 podcast. This is Emma Weinheimer, and today I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Paige Hochschild, the chair of the Mount St. Mary's Theology Department. Welcome, Dr. Hochschild.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do here?
Sure. I am an associate professor of theology, and I'm now in a 3-year term as the department chair of theology. And I've been teaching here full-time for 8 or 9 years. I'm not sure. I think it's 8. Maybe it's 9. And I did teach as an adjunct at the seminary for a couple of years before I taught full-time here. Yeah, so I teach in the core mostly and to theology majors, and I do still teach courses at the seminary as well.
Is there a particular area of theology that you specialize in?
Yes, we all have areas of specialization, but we have to, it's actually one of the privileges of teaching at a place like the Mount is that we all have to extend ourselves in different ways. So in the sub-disciplines of theology, you'd probably describe me as a historical theologian who works in the early church, the Latin early church. But you could also describe me as a systematic theologian who works on the nature of the human person, anthropology, and ecclesiology as well. But I have a background in classical philosophy and classics, and sort of ranged all over the place in my time. But I wrote my dissertation on St. Augustine, so that's why we're sitting across from each other right now, I guess.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about the historical context of St. Augustine's Confessions. I guess to start, if you could tell us a little bit about what was going on in the world around the time that he wrote the Confessions.
Augustine, he's an African. In all the icons you see of him, he looks like a white dude from Europe. He is an African. He's from North Africa, and he ends up being Bishop of Hippo Regius, which is in, I think, present day. Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen the site. It's not Algeria, but it's close. It's a little bit to the east of there. You know, the church in North Africa by this time, he's probably the second great father of that part of the church after Cyprian, tended to be pretty rigorous. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. They tended to be morally intense. So Cyprian is not the first to be famous on the question of what to do about persecuted Christians who apostatized and were readmitted into full communion, whether to allow that.
And what does apostatize mean?
So to deny the faith. So okay. You have the sword, you're going to the Colosseum, and you have to deny Jesus Christ, or we're going to cut your head off, sort of thing. So this was still a problem around that time, the question of persecuted Christians. So whether with regard to that sort of question or with regard to there were just a lot of controversies and divisions in the church that seemed to hit the church in North Africa in a particularly striking black and white sort of way. I can talk about this later. The Donatist controversy, questions about purity and post-baptismal sin. Augustine was dealing with a very rigorous and committed group of people. So that's sort of a general comment about the state of the church and sort of what his ecclesial cultural roots were. On the other hand, by this time, the church was well established. And, this is...
Remind me, when were the Confessions written again?
So you have a chronology there after the introduction, and he wrote it between 397 and 400.
Okay.
So his mother, he was baptized in 387. His mother dies soon after that. He was forcibly ordained in 391, and then he was ordained a bishop. We don't know the exact date, 395, 396. I know forcible ordination sounds weird, but in the context of the early church, when many people preferred to step back from public political ecclesial life and go and pray in a monastery, A, and B, when more often than not, people were put forward for ordination by virtue of the acclamation of the people. Often they had to do it, whether they liked it or not. So he became a priest in a sense, not initially by his own will. So when he starts writing Confessions, and that's a long period of time, he wrote other things in the meanwhile. He ended in 400. He had been a bishop for at least 4 years at that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly from, I think we studied this in the Foundations of Philosophy course.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like an autobiography of his.
Yeah. Yes.
With more like also with his personal musings about the faith and morality and such. But like it's in a nutshell an autobiography. So let's talk a little bit about the content. Like the chapters themselves are really short, but it's a really rich, beautiful text.
Right. Yes, it's a beloved classic, and I think to start to respond to your question, maybe the one other kind of historical contextual thing I'd say is that, you know, Augustine sort of struggles to complete his own education. His parents in different ways want the best for him, as our parents do as well. And he eventually finds a patron who sees him through, but he's very well versed in the best of Roman education. So Romanitas, like Roman culture, is still a thing, dominant, and it's there in North Africa, and it's a kind of high ideal. But he does eventually cross the Mediterranean to complete his training, so to speak, in the liberal arts and rhetoric, and he becomes a teacher. So he's a true academic, and he has pretty harsh things to say about academia, which I can share with you later.
Yes.
Yeah, but he is a man of, he really does stand in a similar but different way from Boethius. He really is straddling the best of the ancient world and the advent of an entirely new order where things are falling apart and the church is trying to find where it fits in all of this sort of thing. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And actually, and if you don't mind, for our listeners who aren't familiar with Boethius, do they complement each other or kind of work with each other? Just a tangent a little bit. Who's this guy? What's his shtick?
Right, yeah. No, Boethius is writing a bit more than a century later. He is in the height of his career. The sort of Roman Christian administration is Arian, which is interesting. Northern barbarians, so to speak, have come down and kind of began their enculturation in the Italian peninsula.
Okay.
But they are Arian Christians, so they have a bad Christology. But he was a great politician and very well educated. And Boethius, who I think in the philosophy core class, professors choose between Augustine and Boethius. His Consolation of Philosophy after the Holy Scriptures, or probably even before the Holy Scriptures, was the single most read book in the Middle Ages and translated.
Wow.
And his life plan was to translate all of Aristotle into Latin, and he didn't get through it. But he was taught, it was one of these Socrates kind of stories where he's thrown in jail and political intrigue, and Lady Philosophy comes to visit him and sort of wipes his tears with the robe of her wisdom and then slaps him across the face and says, "Man up, Boethius. Like, you think that Providence has failed you in some way. You've forgotten the wisdom that is the true wisdom of the ages." So she offers a kind of consolation. But I mean, he's a deeply Orthodox, learned Christian. But he's influenced. It's hard to trace his influences. Some people think he's super kind of a pagan Neoplatonist, but that's just incorrect. And Augustine is all over him, all over the place. So,
so his work in translating Aristotle, Aquinas used Boethius's translations, and that was Aquinas is using a pagan philosopher was huge in the Middle Ages. But okay, so there we go. We're starting to connect the dots a bit. That's good. Yeah. Okay. So
do you want me to go? But would you like me to kind of is that the next step? Is kind of summarize Confessions, or
start with telling us about like the structure of it. If I remember correctly, it's divided into a certain number of books with however many chapters each. And then we can maybe talk about the different themes of each book.
Okay. We'll see how that goes. I'll give you a kind of a brief structural summary.
Yeah.
And you probably read book 1, 2, maybe some stuff later in book 6. Right. So it has 13 books, and most people stop at book 9 just if they're choosing a selection. So there's definitely a kind of narrative break in the text at the end of book 9, which is about he buries his mother. And then you shift into book 10. And he says, okay, now I've been talking about what I have been. Now I'm talking about what I am. So I'm a bishop. This is me, a man. Life goes on. This is like who I am. And then there's another shift signal in the text going into books 11, 12, and 13 at the end. And these books are in some ways, people say they're more sort of philosophically difficult, but I just think they're wonderful. He purportedly begins something that he will attempt many times, which is a kind of interpretation of Genesis. And many philosophers will pay attention to book 11 because it really focuses on the question of what time is. And then he moves into book 12 and 13, and it's not really what that's about. We can get to that later, but he's developing a theology of revelation history that will come to its full fruition in City of God. But yeah,
the City of God, or his text, City of God.
Yeah, St. Augustine's mature work, City of God, which the point at which he is writing, it's very clear that the Roman Empire as a great Christian empire simply will not last. So one form of the crisis that this engenders is it really pushes the question of what the church is to the fore.
Okay.
And so he writes this. It's a complicated text, but one of the sort of central theses is just about how the Holy Roman Empire is not the kingdom of God on earth.
Okay.
So get over it, Roman Christians, But as I said, books 1 through 9 are what most people read. And I like how you put it. It's I think part of why people love Augustine or actually sometimes can't stand him. We read book 10 in one of my seminary classes the other day, and I was surprised at how forward they were at saying all the things they didn't like about him. He does kind of like St. Paul. He puts a lot of himself out there, and like it or you don't. But it's funny, Emma, because in a way it's not a new genre entirely, but like you think about the word confession. What does one confess in the liturgy when we stand up and confess? Sorry, I know you're the one asking the questions. But
No. I was going to say, are you asking rhetorically? Because like my mind initially jumps to the Confiteor at the very beginning of Mass. Right. I confess to Almighty God.
Oh, that was a smart answer. You totally got around my sneaky question.
I don't know what you were trying to ask, but I was there's this thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. The Confiteor it's specifically a confession of sin, but it's the goal of that is like there's a that's sort of the proximate.
It leads to a confession of faith.
Exactly. Yes? Yeah. Okay. And there's a way in which it is all about Augustine, but it's really not about Augustine. It's confessing God. Okay. And it's the story of seeking after God and finding him in his life.
Okay. That makes sense. So he's putting so much of himself out there and like laying so much bare, and like that's really that's really uncomfortable, especially for us. Like I know we're a very public culture, but at the same time, when people like overshare, if you will, we're like, okay, that's enough. So he overshares in a way, but it's not his story. He's revealing truths about God through either his triumphs or his failing.
No, I think that's a nice way of putting it. It really is. It's a confession of God, but the experience that we all have of God in each of our lives has certain distinctive elements to it. But there's times he just goes right at the reader and charges them. Like, what are you reading this for? Like, honestly, do you just want to hear stories about me making it with my girlfriend in church or something like that? Like, why are you reading this? And he's pretty direct. You see that in his sermons a lot too. He's got the finger extended, Are you actually reconciled with your neighbor before you approach the sacred mysteries? You see it in the way he opens the text, and it comes back again and again, I think importantly in book 5 and book 10, before he starts talking about how he was a wicked sinner even as an infant. That really bothers a lot of people, but those of us who are parents know otherwise. My children will never listen to this, so I can say that. Just from the very opening, he says, the purpose of my life, of all of our lives, is to praise you, Lord. Just a little piece of your creation, and to take pleasure in praising you because you've made us for yourself. And here comes famous quotation, our heart is restless until it rests in you. And then he goes to his faith, and then he starts asking the question that he raises again explicitly at the start of book 10, where he says, why am I calling out for you? Like, why am I looking for you? Well, how does that question even make sense? So God made heaven and the earth. Said even as a pagan philosopher, I knew that in you we live and move and have our being. So the personal dimension is just another form of the question is, why do I feel so far away from you? So that's the personal side of it. But then the more sort of objective theological side of it is that he is trying to understand who God is.
And I remember from class, like the first book, like it was this beautiful, beautiful canticle. You are great, Lord, and highly to be praised, and great is your power, and your wisdom is immeasurable. And that first book, like this might be the whole text, but he shifts back and forth beautifully between like this canticle or lamentation to God, and then speaking to the reader, like, I did this, I did that, my boyhood was terrible because I was such a terrible, selfish person, but you, O Lord, are merciful. So, like, that harmony is just stunning.
Yeah. And he's very clear by, there's like the Roman numeral, then the paragraph, but like in book 1:4:4, he says that like the goal of my doing this in a sort of public way is, he says at the end there, on about halfway down page 5, we're looking at the Oxford Chadwick's translation, says, what in words have I said, my God, my life, my holy sweetness? What has anyone achieved in words when he speaks about you? But I have to do this because, he says, the goal of my confession is to love you more and more, to take delight in you, and to encourage others to do the same.
Sounds like Aquinas again.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's a very complex development and kinship between the two of them.
Do you think we can walk through books 1 through 9? Just
sure.
What's his life like, and what are some philosophical themes? Because I know the problem of evil comes up at some point. But
yes, I know you spend a lot of time in the philosophy department. I like to make fun of philosophers, but there is a good. I mean, considering what I said about his background. He's a great illustration of what some Catholic theologians would refer to as the preambula fidei. I prefer to just go back to Aristotle's metaphysics, the idea that we're all made by nature to know. You know, one of the privileges of education is asking some of the most fundamental questions. And these open up almost inevitably by a certain route, the question of God and like, who am I and what am I made for? So anyway, I will make fun of philosophers sometimes, but I'm just doing that to give you a hard time. I mean, book 1 is famous. I think that's the book that many people read in the core, the early years.
Yeah, I definitely read this one.
Yeah, and he does talk about his infancy. It's funny, the infant selfishness. This is often what turns people off from the get-go. Even moderately aristocratic women would not nurse their own children. And so he had a nursemaid who had her own baby to encourage lactation. And he talks about, I want the other one over there. So he's sort of critiquing himself. He says, I really don't remember this on a first person basis, but it sounds like he's looking for something evidently sinful in childish behavior. Okay, from a parenting or just life perspective, we might say this is part of the development of natural, healthy human sociality.
Yeah.
But to be fair, Aristotle himself recognizes this, that if you do not have good formation and correction, that we are ordered to survival, to life, and we are in some sense fundamentally selfish. So I think he's kind of identifying early on certain traits that are the foundation for his more developed adolescent selfishness.
There's a point in which I believe St. Paul talks about like the baseness of childish behavior. So like you said, like from the parenting perspective, you recognize like there's a value to that in healthy development. But if you stay in that baseness for too long, then it's not healthy and it's turning away from what you're actually called to be.
Right. And that idea of progress, development, like I mentioned to you, that moving from the last 3 books of Confessions to City of God, Augustine is really developing. Irenaeus is maybe a first step here, an earlier church father. He's developing a theology of revelation as history. And that idea of that we're called to grow up is essential. It's essential to that. And so you're picking up on St. Paul's language of the old man and the new man. The first man is Adam, the new man is Christ. And we have this image in us by nature, but we've lost our likeness to God, our luster, our brilliance. And so what's happening in the life of faith is this refining, this burning up, this being transformed, as St. Paul says, according to the mind of Christ that is in us, Or as St. Catherine of Siena says, according to the heart of Christ. She asked for Christ to put his heart in her. Christ's heart is not in me, but that's something to aspire to, I suppose. Yeah, so the idea of like stages of development is really important for Augustine.
So he was looking for something sinful in infancy to try to set the stage for himself for why he became the way that he was as an adolescent.
Yes, or even just sort of tendencies, because he is careful. You know, he's not saying, well, like the fact that a baby wants more milk is not evil. He's not saying that. He's just looking for inclinations, as St. Thomas would call them, that could, without formation and grace and courage, become the basis later for more vicious behavior.
Okay.
Maybe more than sort of going through each book there, a couple things arise that will be recurring themes. He talks about his education eventually, but like in paragraphs 15, 16, he comes back often to entertainment, public shows, which are a little different than they are now. And he's admitting that, well, it sounds all fine and good to talk about maturation as the goal of human life, but becoming an adult also involves a wide variety of rationalizations of infantile behavior. Like, I don't know if you ever heard from your parents, well, I can do this because I'm a grown-up or something like that. I'm sure you never did from your parents. But, you know, he says in paragraph 15, he says, we love to play. Punishments were imposed on us by those who are engaged in adult games. For the amusement of adults is called business. Oof. When boys play such games, are punished by adults, and no one feels sorry for the children or for the adult, and so on and so forth. So he's also critiquing how some of these inclinations, when they become sort of socially, culturally justified, adults just are immature as well in different ways and engage in immature pursuits. But the public shows are really interesting. We could come back to that later. I'm just taking a look here. He critiques his education. Yeah, it's if you take a look, you have page 15, 16, paragraph 21.
I'm sorry.
And it's still in book 1. If you have paragraph 21 or so.
Okay, yes.
He'll come back to this again, but I just think it's fascinating because he observes that he loved to go to the theater and he'd watch these shows and just be like, oh, it's so beautiful. And but there was this sense that deep within his own heart, he was just hollow. It's like he was, and he described himself as going out of himself, flinging himself on beautiful things, emotional things. I think that there's something deeply resonant here, the ways that we try to experience things vicariously without, we can finish that sentence probably in 10 different ways, but he describes himself as just being devoid of authentic feeling. And he uses this terminology of like, it's the bird lime of concupiscence. It's like he's scratching at his soul, just trying to feel. So he's sort of entering into this sort of perhaps arguably adolescent feeling-driven period of his life, but but he experienced it as a kind of madness, basically. And so he just lived it through other people and threw himself into whatever was right in front of his face. It was fiction. I mean, I think he's troubled by the falsehood of the stories, but I think what he's really troubled about is the falsehood of his own emotional experience.
Whether he knew that or not at the time.
Yes, yeah. He just didn't feel, he talks more, he'll come back to just the failure to feel a basic kind of compassion or sorrow. So it's just much easier to turn on Netflix and just like get caught up in something emotionally than just turn off all the stimuli and just, let's look at where my relationship with Emma is broken, for example. Our relationship is fine, but just isn't, you know what I mean? Or what? Or
no,
what,
I do.
What is this thing in my heart that I choose not to really address or look at?
Yeah, and I'm sure that was a huge source of sorrow for his mom. I know that St. Monica prayed for him for I don't even know how many years.
Yes, I think all of her life.
Yeah, like she died shortly after he was baptized. You said, or
yes, right away. Yeah, almost right away. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't even imagine how much that must have hurt her to be praying for this, like for her son, but like
terrible
this,
son,
like, complete like emotionally removed thing. Yeah. Like I would hate to refer to a person as that, but like when you're that emotionally devoid, you're just existing.
Yes, yeah. And she was probably a bit of a pain in the neck as a mother.
I mean, yeah.
There's a scene where he tricks her and she's standing on the shore while he sails away, and he says, I feel terrible about that now, but yeah, she was hounding him, no doubt, but that's, you do the best that you can. So as a parent, that is, I suppose. Yeah, so I mean, going on, book 2 on is maybe a bit more famous. He gets into sort of certain hallmark things about adolescence. He really focuses much more on sexual desire and lust. It's not only that, but it's very much about that. And he's just throwing himself into pleasure. And oh my goodness, we confront soon the famous story of the theft of pears. And you realize here, getting into book 2, that this is a work of literary art. Okay, this is not the first tree that we're with fruit that we're going to meet, right? He's going to ultimately give his heart over to Christ, reading St. Paul under a tree. And of course, you have the trees in Genesis and the tree upon which our Lord is crucified.
Trees are important in Scripture.
They're very important, yes. So this is, you always have to keep in mind, it's raw, it's personal, but it's very carefully crafted. I'm on, I think our pages are the same on page 33. Yes, I think you do read this in the core of this passage.
Yeah, I do remember this story.
And it had been presented to me in different contexts as though here is where we see Augustine contending with the complete meaninglessness of sin. And that's incorrect. And what people usually mean by that is he keeps asking over and over again, why did I do this? I didn't want the fruit. It was stupid, so on and so forth. It seems like, whereas Aristotle and St. Thomas after him would say, we're always after some good. That's what moves our appetite, our will, even if it's not actually a good. And I've heard often Augustine contrasted to this position as though this episode proves that sin, if we say that sin or evil is nothing, what that means at the moral level is that we can be drawn to something that is a nothing, and that's what sin is in its darkest form. But it's pretty clear here what is moving him. In paragraph 16, I do not like this translation. He says, does it follow that I love something other than the theft, like the thrill of the act itself, that rush of adrenaline? He says, no, nothing else in reality, because association with the gang is also a nothing. What is it in reality? So it sounds like he's backing off from the gang, the friends, but he keeps on coming back to this at the bottom of the page. He says, I would not have done it alone. And he says, at the very end of the book, friendship can be a dangerous enemy, a seduction of the mind lying beyond the reach of investigation. So he did it for friendship. And he did it because of his mates, because he knows that friendship is a true good. This is really interesting, and I think it stood the test of time approach to the structure of books 1 through 9. You can find an article by Frederick Crossan where he sees sort of 5 as the center, and there's like it radiates out, and there's really interesting parallels between the books that would correspond one with another. Okay. So the key thing at 5, and what you see emerging there, is he starts using this very strong language of hidden providence working in a secret way. So that's where, like, every great conversion story, in a sense, has that moment, with the luxury of hindsight, of course, where the author realizes that he or she can see that God was doing something despite him or herself. At any rate, a really important element, in fact, 3 pairs of elements in book 5 that he'll come back to, is friendship or the community. So Faustus is his Manichee teacher, and then by the end of book 5, he's with Ambrose, and Ambrose is reading the scriptures and he's listening to his preaching. A bad friendship gives way to a good friendship, so on and so forth. So that dimension of friendship, of the life of virtue in community one with another, is absolutely crucial for Augustine. So anyway, that's just something that needs to be said about the theft of pears.
Yeah.
So I'll go on and much more quickly. So we get more about education, book 3, and you see right away he hits the Manichees. He's still thinking about friendship.
And the Manichees believed what again?
So Manicheism, it depends who you read, depending on the text, the source, and with all these guys, we often have access to what they think through the words of their interlocutors. So they may be more complex and not as stupid sounding as they do, like in Augustine's mouth. You know what I mean? Like it's when you're being reported by your enemy, so to speak. But broadly speaking, Manichaeism, I mean, religion was even though Christianity was functionally established and fully legal after the Edict of Milan, it was a very eclectic time. I mean, there's just stuff all over the place, different forms of what we call pagan, just meaning non-Christian worship and belief. So Manicheism was a form of dualism, so tended to believe in a very sort of concrete, there's an evil principle and then there's a good principle. And the cosmos is marked by this war between the two.
Okay, that was it.
So that's where, setting up for the Platonic solution to evil, he had to let go of the kind of materialism that dominated his way of thinking about moral categories.
Okay.
And they did, like most religious groups tend to, have very complex liturgical practices. So diet, behavior, very dualistic in their picture of the human person.
Okay, so he's talking about his education and his time with the Manichees, and that, like, if I remember correctly, like, it sounded kind of cultish in that, like, they're like each level there was like, okay, so like you'll learn like the secret to like what's going to solve this war between the good and the evil, and then he eventually reached the top. I forget which book this was in, and the elder or leader just looked at him and was like, I have no idea. Like, that's the secret. I don't know. In some ways his intellect is going, or his intelligence is going to be very helpful for him in a way. But it's just, in a way, I don't fully understand. It's sort of bizarre that he spent as much time with them as he did, because they just sound crazy, totally crazy. I mean, but like you said, he spent so much of his life craving friendship and community that he and it also, as you said, like a lot of your adult life is rationalizing childish behavior. So he must have spent so much time with them trying to rationalize. Okay, like I'm gonna figure it out. Like I'll stick it out with them, figure it out, and I will have my peeps. And then he didn't.
And defining what a cult is a tricky matter. I mean, Manicheism was very elitist, structurally speaking. Initiation is very structured. I mean, I do think, by contrast, he says when he starts to hear about or read or hear proclaim the Christian scriptures, he disses like their literary baseness, and this is super confusing and inconsistencies here, there, and everywhere. I think part of the reason that one of many reasons why he jumps into actually interpreting scripture in the end is that this is one of the hallmarks, sort of apologetic hallmarks of the Christian faith, is it's all out there. Like, we got no secrets. And we've exposed the sacred scriptures to biblical criticism in all of its forms, and there's no secret rituals that people don't know about. You just go read the Code of Canon Law or go to Vatican.va or the Vatican website. So
or join the Knights and you will learn their initiation.
You will have feathers on your head.
And a sword. The swords are cool.
Okay. So he goes on. If you want me to move on, I mean the Concubine.
In which book is this?
So going on book 4. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in all these books. He continues. I can just pull out maybe like one thing from each, because he does touch on a lot. I mean, the idea of concubinage sounds very odd to us, but because marriage was seen not primarily as like a affective union for that completes you in some way, sort of socially or emotionally. It was much more I think in the pre-modern era about making the right match. It's about family and name and career and all that kind of stuff. So concubinage was in part established as a way to just deal with and give a guy somewhere to go in a sort of respectable public way before the official marriage was made. So she was never going to be his wife in the full legal sense. But from his perspective, it really wasn't about his career, his property, or anything like that. Says, just on the second page of book 4 there, he said, I was not after a partnership for the sake of having a family and the mutual consent of those, and so on and so forth. I think it was a real union, and there was a real affection, and there was a child, a Deodatus, who died soon after he was ordained. I think that's right. After Monica died. So I think it was a real relationship, but it's hard for us to imagine this kind of multi-tiered approach to legal marriage. And from his side, it was basically, I just need somebody, to comfort me at the end of the day. And he's, talks a lot about his lust and his intellectual curiosity all at the same time. Yeah, and he comes back to friendship here once again. And in book 5, as I said, after book 5, you have a more focused treatment of the books of the Platonists. And if you want to talk about that, we can. But as I said, part of why book 5 is so important is, in a way, that one of the obstacles to him considering the faith more seriously is his intellectual pride. And that he wanted to be a part of an elite group where just the select few got to know all the secret rituals and handshakes and such. And he needed to turn to the church, as it were, and see that the scripture, whether it's the scriptures in themselves and their rhetorical simplicity, or on the other hand, just the universality, just everyone's here, all are welcome of the church. He needed to find a way to consider that, to really kind of be open to that. So as I said in book 5, he has a real personal crisis. A friend of his dies.
Yes.
Book 5, right?
I think that was pretty late book 4 as I'm kind of like flipping through.
Yes, that's right. You're right. 65 on, he talks about his book on beauty. He's just falling apart because of this friend who he loses. And he says, "Oh my gosh, like, I know, Lord, from this perspective where I am right now, sitting here writing, that we should love things in a just and orderly way, as though they're transient goods." It just seems very harsh on himself. It's like, you're supposed to cry when you lose somebody that you love. But he's setting up for what's coming in book 5, because I think he has a hunger and a desire. He can't, Emma, connect the joy and the beauty he sees in another person with this other more permanent. Everything's just being taken away from him one after another. The pleasure, the good things, they come and they go, and he remains sort of empty at the end of the day. So
yeah,
this is where he famously mentions, I read the categories and they were pretty easy, so I think we go on. But yes, in book 5, among other things, one of the most he does confront, it wasn't Faustus, I'm sorry, it was Mani himself. Although he's working with Faustus, my apology. And by the end of book 5, he is, again, you can see, if you look on page 80, for example, paragraph 13, "In your hidden providence, my God, you did not forsake my soul. My mother's tears night and day, sacrifice was being offered to you from the blood of her heart. You dealt with me in wonderful ways." So there's a glimmers of hope and sweetness here. And he says very clearly, you were bringing this about, paragraph 14, you were at work persuading me to go to Rome. So he has a sense that God was starting to move him. And God is getting a little bit impatient with him. And yes, he deceives his mom because he's a terrible son. But then by the end, it's just very interesting when he's with Ambrose. He says on page 87 there, he says, "He valiantly ministered to your people the abundance of your sustenance, the gladness of oil, the sober intoxication of your wine." So he's smart. He is his teacher, Ambrose, and he is a good preacher, and he's patient. But really, most important, on page 88, a few lines down, he says, "As a human being who is kind to me." There's something really basic there in Augustine that is just being met, and I think that they became friends. And he said, "I went to hear his preaching because I want to evaluate his oratory." But interestingly enough, even through that vanity on my part, God was like, "I'm going to work through this man somehow." He says he taught the sound doctrine of salvation. And he said, "The words that I was enjoying, the subject matter in which I was unconcerned, came to make an entry into my mind. I could not separate them. While I opened my heart," and for Augustine, as for St. Paul, the heart is so important. It's the center of the person. In noting the eloquence, he said, "There also entered no less the truth that he affirmed only gradually." And then he sees how this is related to the Platonist, the way Plato helps him solve his materialism. He says, "So also did he begin to understand that many passages in the Old Testament need to be interpreted figuratively or spiritually." And he needed to start to look at the Bible as a kind of argument, like a whole that's pointing towards Jesus Christ. So he's looking for, as he says in 25, spiritual substance. Thus he has to conceive spiritual substance correctly. And then he, by the end of this book, decides to become a catechumen in the church. So something about Ambrose and his preaching and the beauty that comes. And that's a really interesting passage where he says, I went for the beauty of his words, but the truth accompanied it. Later in book 10, when he sits down and says, okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about what I am now. And he'll analyze the way pleasure draws us in towards good things. But because we're sinners, sometimes we separate the true good of the thing from the pleasure. Yeah. And he talks about that time, when I went to the EF Mass and there's Emma up there playing the organ and someone's chanting. And I'm just like, she is so good. And, it's so beautiful. And
then you forget you're at Mass.
And this is one of those passages where I looked at the other day and some of the seminarians were like, oh, come on, get over yourself. But this is a huge, concern and a matter of great importance for the church, from reading Sacrosanctum Concilium on liturgy and such, that trying to find a balance between the affective, what's moving, and then the intellectual, rational good, and to have all aspects of the liturgy draw on both of those, move both of those in a balanced way. It's really hard.
It is, because you called my feet to the fire. As a liturgical music person, that is a very, very difficult balance to find, especially on a college campus where you have people of so many different opinions and tastes.
The relationship to Augustine, I hope, is clear there. It has to be authentic. It has to
draw you in towards the good.
It has to draw you in towards the good. Anyway, and I know you asked me not to do a really long summary, so let me go really fast through the stuff that philosophy students love. So all the questions are opened up about Manicheism and the questions about the nature of evil. He just realizes it just takes him so long. He's trying to figure out, what am I going to do with my career, my life? And he has a bit of a professional crisis that he details in book 6.
Okay.
I mean, on the one hand, he's working to understand who God is at a very basic level. Just that God is radically distinct from the created order, that he's transcendent. And that then will be the foundation for understanding how God could be this relentless, loving, consistent, providential being in his life. And then at a more personal level, he's still reflecting on kind of career, which he eventually abandons, but then also his own personal choices. So like on page 100, he talks about the, continence, for example. And this is a really important concept for Augustine. It is about sexual lust and indulgence, but when he says later, oh Lord, make me continent, but just not yet. In book 10 and later, he will talk about continence as a principle of order, bringing all of his loves into a right relation one toward another, including those things that pertain to the sexual powers, but it's also the whole of his life. People sort of represent Augustine as kind of obsessed with sex and his background here and this and that, and there may be something to it, but I think that can really be overstated too much. I think that this is the literary function of lust for him, is like, this is one thing in a certain sense. It's, as St. Thomas says, it's perhaps the most powerful desire, so it very easily dominates all the others. But he cannot, by his own will and strength, take that and fit it into a larger orderly whole. So it's just thrown everything out of whack, so to speak.
If I may venture to go here, there is the element of sexual desire and other things like that, and that sort of lust. But I was in conversation with another professor a while ago, and we were talking about temperance, and like, you can have a lack of temperance for other things. He craved community and so many other things to such a degree that all of his desires became a sort of lust. So yes, he needed to order his sexual desires in the bigger picture of everything else. Like, when he realized his emptiness, he was so hungry to fill that he was way over there, and then had to like bring everything back into its proper picture.
Yeah. I think by picture you're getting at what I'm saying by order.
Yes,
because he considers in book 6 there, like in paragraph 20 to 22, he's like, I didn't really want to get married. And he had other things on his mind, quite frankly. But he says, I thought I'd be miserable if I were deprived of the embrace of a woman, and this and that. But he said, I believe continence to be achieved by personal resource, which I was not aware of possessing. I was so stupid as not to know that no one can be continent unless you grant it. So there's like two things here, coming back to what you're saying. I mean, the big picture thing is he's trying to fix his own problems, and he has to submit to this duality of the church on the one hand and the primacy of grace. He has to let Christ live within him absolutely and be his Lord. But at a more practical, psychological level, what he's saying there is it's people represent it, I think, give Augustine a bad rap even on marriage, even though his mature work on marriage is basically the foundation for all Catholic theology on marriage, at least as represented in the Code and the Catechism. But he says here that he acknowledges that he should not get married because he didn't want it for the right reasons. And I think this is really important, and it's something that, for example, John Paul II addresses head-on in Theology of the Body. He's not the first to sort of nuance or actually shift dramatically this interpretation of St. Paul, as though he's saying, look, I want you all to be like me, but if you're too lustful and weak, fine, get married. The marriage bed is honorable in all men. He interprets that, again, he's not the first, as this is a unique challenge in the way of holiness, but marriage is a good. And what Augustine is saying here is that from the get-go, he would have violated marriage. Marriage is not about, getting a young couple up to the altar. We're going to follow the law of the church, the teachings of the church, and go crazy, people. It's, as John Paul II says, the lust of the eyes can be deployed within marriage itself. You can use your spouse. So he, in a sense, this is maybe stretching the explicit text right in front of me in Book 6, but he's saying, I just would have kept on using this person for the sake of satisfying my own lust, so I couldn't do it. So he wants that continence.
So I know you mentioned wanting to get to some of the other questions that we have in philosophy, and for as much as I would love to go through the other books,
let's move on.
Just to kind of briefly wrap up, the rest of it is just the rest of his life prior to his mother's death, and then mourning his mother and burying her.
He has to let it go. He has to allow grace to be the primary thing in his life, and he can't solve the problem that he's dealing with. Romans 7 and 8 is always a central paired text for Augustine. He echoes it many times. The law of sin within me, and he says at one point, I have no idea what side is gonna win. So he has to sort of shift over into the logic of Romans 8, which is, thanks be to God that nothing can separate us from the love of Jesus Christ that is in us. So So where do you want to go after this then?
I don't know.
I guess I could just say, really briefly that, 9 is interesting because, as I said, it's the death of his mother, and he's praising her. But then he also says that he doesn't leave her as a plaster saint for us. He says, well, I do remember she used to lose her temper, and she was really annoying sometimes, and she'd have a little too much to drink at night sometimes. And the literary point of that is simply to say, look, who knows the heart of a man? We do not even know ourselves. So he's sort of addressing in a more general way the mystery of the person. Only God, only the Spirit that is within us truly discerns us. So it sets up for Book 10, where he shifts to not what I have been, but what I am. So he examines himself, and I've written and taught a lot about this, so I kind of want to jump over it a bit. But long treatment. It is a treatment of memory that is developed in Book 11, but it's the focus on the one hand, the sort of intellective judgment, perception side of the person, and then the second half on the life of the will in relationship to the rational powers. It has that beautiful passage in the center where he invokes the spiritual senses. Late have I loved you, thou beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved you. I was looking for you everywhere out there, and nope. And you touched my soul, and I long for you. I pant for your delight. But the problem that is set up by the end of Book 10 is the problem of post-baptismal sin, and he's ordained by this time, as I said, as a bishop. And, we have within our freedom the capacity to be a living contradiction of the truth. So it's kind of like a final sort of summary theological, statement or reflection. He says, it's all on you, Jesus. You're going to make this work. And in there's this beautiful brief passage where he reads St. Anthony, and he says, well, I'm going to run off to the desert and do battle with my sin in a cave. And the Lord says, if you can't be holy in the world and the church, then you're not going to be holy in a cave. So, what are you running from exactly? Where are you running to? Mm-hmm. So he has to put Christ there in the forefront. So, yeah. But then the last three books, I said, people think that it's a sort of abstract treatment of time. He never defines time in it. He gives a couple of possibilities. But as I said, he's sort of starting with Genesis, and that's kind of cool. So that's why he's talking about time, and then he sort of moves into space, in a sense, in Book 12. But he's really in that he's talking about two things. In Book 12, he talks about this thing, the heaven of heavens, because it's brought out more explicitly in City of God. We have these angels appearing in Scripture, but their creation is never explicitly discussed. But he's talking about that, the souls and the blessed souls. How can we be enfleshed, or not enfleshed for a time, beings in time? How can we enjoy the peace and the eternity of God as finite creatures? And that's a really important sort of question that Boethius will take up as well. So Book 12 and 13, on the one hand, he's talking about this heaven of heavens, asking, again, how can we enjoy the peace of God? At the same time, though, he's starting into, the conclusion, Book 13, is this is what the church is. It's supposed to be the best possible instantiation of the heaven of heavens on this earth, even if it doesn't feel like that most days of the week. But he's also really beginning a very complex scriptural exegesis, and maybe this is the last thing I could just mention. In Book 12, he's looking at details in Genesis 1. He's like, what's the firmament above the waters? What's it? Well, some people say it's this, some people say it's that, and he says, and this, I hope it becomes evident how he's really developing his sense of the church. And he says, I'm in page 253, Book 12, chapter 13, paragraph 16. This is my provisional understanding. I hear Scripture say this. He sort of steps back and summarizes. He says, there's some other people who just find something different here. And he's very sophisticated. He's like, some people ask the question, this is a big theological question today, about the intention of the human author. He's like, who knows what the intention of the human author is? And he says, but, we could come up with 10 interpretations of what the firmament above the water is. He says the key thing is that we are reading and praying Scripture within the church, and we are not violating the law of charity. So he's basically saying you could have many interpretations and they're all true, life-giving and good, but they have to fall under the rule of faith, and they have to ultimately be life-giving for the church in some way. If you look at 265, he takes the reflection from Book 10 about the transcendence of God. He says, he talks about the common truth. This is the private good versus the common good. He says, the most important thing is that we do not love a truth because it's ours. We have to love the truth because it's the truth. And that is, just by its very nature, going to be higher than us. So he says at the bottom of that page there in paragraph 35, in the base of these two commandments of love, Moses meant whatever he meant in those books. If we do not believe, we make the Lord a liar, because we attribute to the mind of a fellow servant a notion other than what he taught. See how stupid it is, among so large a mass of correct interpretations, which can be elicited from those words, rashly to assert that a particular one has the best claim to Moses' view. That's really getting at some interesting questions of modern biblical scholarship. But then he says, we on the previous page there, he says, what we have to watch out for is when we love, our own opinion, not because it is true, but because it's mine. So that sort of completes his critique of what he saw as the ambitious pridefulness of his rhetorical academic training. He's pretty tough on academics. Yeah. He calls it academia, a society of praise and dispraise. Oof. That's tough.
It is tough. Well, do you have any final thoughts on Confessions or any particular translations that you recommend?
Oh, My Weight is My Love. We really did. Book 13, the best is always at the end. It's true for On the Trinity as well, and frankly for City of God as well. It's beautiful. You have to read Book 13 if no other part of it. Augustine has a really rich theology of hope, and I was talking with somebody the other day about how there's very little actually published about that. So translations, New City Press, if you go up to the Catholic Studies reading room, you'll see like the sermons there, very expensive. Mm-hmm. New City Press is putting out what are most people consider the best standard translations now. Okay. Sometimes they're a little bit quirky. I have here the translation, the Loeb edition I used in my classics undergraduate program, and you become attached with the first thing, but it is pretty old-fashioned. I love it because there's a Latin text on the side. Aww. But yes, those impostors whom they style astrologers, I verily did not forbear to consult with. So it's very old-fashioned English, but that's Watts in the Loeb edition. But yeah, anything in the New City Press series is recommended by most people. So
okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome. It's been lovely.
Yes.